Today's lesson is going to focus on just solving some word problems using proportions. So we're going to start every problem after we read through it by just setting up a proportion that's going to talk about which words or labels we're going to be comparing. When you have a proportion, if you remember, we're just setting two ratios equal to each other, and a ratio is defined as a comparison of two quantities using division. So we're always going to have a fraction, and when you compare things, it doesn't matter how you compare them, it just matters that you're consistent. So if you read through this first problem, it says the goal of the Hartford Library is to have 2 books in stock for every 5 residents. So you can kind of see here that we're going to be comparing books to residents. So I'm going to start by just writing that ratio down, books over residents. Reading on, it says the population of Hartford is about 10,000. So we need to update our statistics here a little bit, but we'll just go with it. Find the total number of books that the library should have in order to meet the goal. So that's our problem. So we want to define what our unknown is. So we're going to say that X is going to represent the number of books. So from here, you need to set up a proportion to solve this. So let's just do the template. Draw your 2 fraction bars and your equal sign without filling in anything. That's what your problem should look like. And now we're going to use our words or labels to help us. We said we're going to compare books to residents. Well, in that first sentence, it says we have 2 books for every 5 residents. So our first fraction is going to be 2 over 5. Now we've designated the numerator to represent books. So because X represents the number of books, on the other side of the proportion we should have X. And then the 10,000 represents the residents, so that's going to go on the bottom. And then this is a fairly simple proportion to solve. You just cross multiply, so we would end up with 5x equals 20,000. Divide both sides by 5. And if you don't want to show the divide by 5 again, that's fine. You can just go ahead and write that answer. But if you want to show it, that's fine too. So x is 4,000 in this case. And then you want to think about just making sure you're answering the question. So really, you should probably write out the library should have 4,000 books. So a little bit of an answer statement here. It just shows that you know what you're finding and you know how to summarize that. All right, the next problem, we're looking at a recipe for some sugar cookies. It calls for 4 cups of flour, and the recipe will make about 36 cookies. So I'm comparing the cups of flour to the number of cookies. If you read on, the question asks us how many cups of flour are needed to make 81 cookies. So our unknown here, our X, is going to represent cups of flour. And then again, just kind of set up your proportion template. We know that every problem is going to be set up this way. And then look at what we're comparing. We're always comparing flour to cookies. So that means I have to put the 4 cups on top, the 36 cookies on the bottom. And then on the other side, I have to be consistent. So I'm looking for flour. So X is going to go on the top, and 81 is going to go on the bottom. So when you cross multiply, the equation that gets set up is 36x equals 324. When you divide both sides, you get x equals 9. So our answer statement here is 9 cups of flour are needed to make 81 cookies. And again, there's no law that says that the flour has to go on top and the cookies have to go on the bottom. If you were to flip it around, you would just have to be consistent. And on both sides of your proportion, you'd have to have the cookies on top and then the flour on the bottom. So you have a little bit of leeway here. You just have to make sure that you're being consistent. All right, our last problem here, we're looking at a recipe for chili. If you want to make chili for 12 people, you need 3 pounds of ground beef, 8 tomatoes, and then some spices. So for part A, the question says how many pounds of ground beef are needed to make enough chili for 50 people? So here it looks like we're going to be comparing beef to people. So how many pounds of beef for how many people? X is actually going to stand for pounds of beef. And when we set up our template, we know that for 12 people, we need 3 pounds of beef. So the first ratio is going to be 3 over 12. And then on the other side, it would be x over 50, because we know we want a recipe for 50 people. So cross multiply, we get 12x equals 150. And when you solve, x is 12.5. Okay, so we need 12.5 pounds of beef to make chili for 50 people. And well, let's just write 12.5 pounds of beef, or I think you get the answer statement. All right, part B, now we're just looking at how many tomatoes are needed to make enough chili for 65 people. So we've changed the conditions a little bit. Now we're comparing tomatoes to people. The question is asking how many tomatoes, so we need to say X is number of tomatoes. And when we set up our proportion, we're comparing tomatoes to people. So 8 tomatoes for 12 people equals X over 65. Cross multiply, we get 12X equals 520. And X is, when we divide here, we're going to get a decimal. So again, we're going to just round it to the nearest hundredth, so 43.33. So hopefully you planted a lot of tomato plants here, because you're going to need about 43 tomatoes to make enough chili for 65 people. Now notice I rounded that down to 43 because I don't know that you're going to take a third of a tomato. You're either going to take 43 tomatoes or you're going to take 44. So notice I just put the word about in front of that. That kind of corrects for the fact that I didn't take the decimal answer that I got. I'm interpreting the answer to answer the question.